Okay, welcome to Boston Basic Income, our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. And this week we're talking about the idea of universal basic assets. So universal basic assets is, it's often,
competitor.
what's that?
A competitor.
A competitor. It's often proposed as an alternative to universal basic income. And the difference is that instead of giving people money, you're giving people things that you think they need the most, or things that we've kind of determined that people need the most. And some of us read an article in Aussie by Molly Fosco entitled "Universal Basic Assets: A Smarter Fix Than Universal Basic Income." So yeah.
Hello.
Hey man. Hey Rob. So this is Bethany, Steve, and Richard. We just got started on the live stream. So yeah, we're talking about universal basic assets. So the idea is that, if you want to be on camera, you can sit over here. If you don't want to be on camera, you can sit over there. It's up to you. Definitely, I encourage you to be on camera.
Where's the sucker over here?
That's the camera.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah. So if you sit on this side, you will not be on. Yeah.
We're live, right?
We're live. Yeah. Everyone's seeing this.
YouTube.com/
Boston Basic Income.
There we are.
Yeah, so guys, also cool announcement. A couple weeks ago, we got over 100 subscribers on the channel. So now we have a custom URL. So it's youtube.com/Boston Basic Income. Yeah, so we're talking about universal basic assets. And the idea with universal basic assets is that you are giving people specific things that they need rather than universal basic income, which is giving them money. So I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on what they think about the idea of universal basic assets as compared to basic income.
Well, it'll be interesting to talk more about it because I don't feel like I have a good sense of what the specific proposals are. But
Okay.
I guess my sense is that income is very flexible and people can spend it on the things that they need the most. But there are some kinds of things that are more efficient to be provided centrally and not purchased individually. So some of the things they listed were like public transportation and healthcare, and I would put those in a category where I think central provision makes sense, and then other kinds of things maybe doesn't. And there are lots of reasons to go into for why one thing would fall in one category or the other.
Yeah. Okay. Any initial thoughts?
Versus, we're talking UBI as in a classical sense.
UBI is money, and then UBA is other specific targeted things, giving people. There's a whole bunch of different things, but job training, housing, stuff like that. Yeah.
Job training, you certainly cannot underestimate the value that brings to people. Point blank, folks who want to be, quote unquote, contributing members of society often don't have the means to access job training. So any way you can deliver on that promise, which isn't one that's expressly in the Constitution, I should say, but is one that the government indeed makes, it's important to follow through on it. Sure.
Cool. Thanks, Steve.
Well, I think UBA is more paternalistic than UBI, sort of saying that people don't really know what's best for them. On the other hand, as far as like medical insurance, we kind of are saying that. Rather than giving people the extra another $1,000 a month, we're holding it back and just giving everybody medical insurance, saying we really have decided that that's the wisest thing for everyone.
Yep. Richard.
Well, the way I think of it is that there was this charity that I donated to 12 years ago or something like that, where they gave out things for Africans, and they didn't have an option just to give people money. They had we'll give you a goat or various things like that. And maybe someone doesn't need another goat. They'd rather have money that they could spend on a water filtration system or something, or combine the money with all the other people in the village so they can buy a large purchase. But without the money, they would just be forced to sell things until they actually can afford it or never actually get the thing that they want.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think Steve said it right, that UBA is more paternalistic, and you're kind of like, and Bethany also, that, you know, if you give people money, they get to decide what they need and what they want. If you're saying they can't have money, or if you're saying we're giving you this other stuff, then they're saying we're not trusting you to provide that for yourself. But I think it's also true, as Steve mentioned, that you can, there are some things for which we can't trust people to provide it for themselves. So that's when, you know, health insurance comes in, or you know, other things, infrastructure, stuff like that. People that, you know, that won't naturally, you know, come together and build their own stuff. That's what the government is for. So my mom says that giving money is far simpler. Money brings choice, and I think that's right. And I think that for the things where people are good at knowing what they want and getting it for themselves, that's where money can be the most effective. So I think housing probably falls under that. So one of the things that's being proposed by the UBA people is to provide people housing, just housing itself as an asset. But I think housing is one of the things, if you have the money to buy it, you're going to buy it. You don't have to worry about not trusting people to buy houses. I think that's, or buy apartments or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I can say a little bit more on that since I brought up the same idea.
Yeah.
Like two things that make it more likely that it's not going to work out on an individual basis. One is if it's a public goods problem. So, for example, a public transit system, you can't just fund it unilaterally yourself. That doesn't make sense. It's for everybody.
Right.
So everybody would need to put in a little bit, but then everyone has an incentive to free ride on everybody else and hope that they'll pay for it and you don't have to. And so in those kinds of situations, like, those are possible to overcome in a decentralized way, but they're difficult. So if you have a centralized authority that stands for the public good, like a government, it's much more efficient to solve public goods problems that way.
I actually saw an article a few years ago about the Greek transit system and about how it would be cheaper to give everyone free taxi rides instead, because it's so inefficient, and you have to pay for the upkeep of all the trains and things.
Right. Well, that
Wow.
sounds like an example where maybe that's not being managed well, or that shouldn't exist. But
Yeah.
I guess I was assuming if it's efficient, but that's an interesting example.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always the danger that when you have something managed publicly by the government, that it runs into inefficiencies. So we need to be very careful.
Very much.
You know, like, there are certain things where it just is more efficient to handle in a central way, but we want that to be managed properly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the question of universal basic assets is really interesting because in a lot of ways, it's the same question as what should be managed by the government and what should be managed by the market.
Right.
And
I wasn't done, but keep going.
and in here, when we talk about stuff being managed by the market, that's funded by the basic income. And then the government provides the things that aren't naturally allocated by the market. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I was going to give two different things, because we also talked about health insurance, which doesn't have that property of being a public good, but does have the property of having these sort of like risks where you might have like a huge expense and it might happen early or it might happen late, and it's hard to save and plan for that. And if it happens early, you wouldn't have had time to save enough and things like that. So insurance is a different category for a different reason.
And there's also the whole thing about how the individual mandate being invalidated and things like that, and so people not wanting to buy insurance, so they just let other people cover the cost for them when something actually does happen to them.
Right, yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So, I mean, in what sense is it not a public goods problem? Or are you saying there's this other aspect
There's
to
this
it?
other aspect to it, I guess. Well, what is the public goods problem part? Just like contagion and stuff like that?
There's also, well, I mean, that's like for vaccines and stuff, yeah. And yeah, I guess general
Just
wellness.
anything, yeah.
But there's also the, medical infrastructure that we have in place, who's paying for that kind of thing. If it's not, if there are people out there who know that, oh, there's a hospital down the street and it's being funded somehow, then,
That's what I guess
that's what Richard was talking
up.
about. Yeah.
Richard,
Oh.
will you go into that again, what you were saying? Because I think it was, I didn't quite catch the entire gist of it, but I think it clearly was important to the conversation.
about the individual mandate being invalidated by, and so everyone had to. The people didn't want to pay for it, so they just waited until something happened to them and everyone else covered the cost for them.
It's like
Yeah.
if they're not going to be, let's say people are not going to be turned away at an emergency room. I think this is what you're saying. Like there can be kind of a free riding problem where you just go to the emergency room, but you don't pay for health insurance up front, that kind of thing.
Which would
Yeah.
be something theoretically, or at least technically speaking, which could be at least stemmed by something like a UBI type policy that says, hey, if you got a few extra spare $100 on you, you can soup up your insurance so that those hospital visits under any, you break a leg or you break a neck,
Right.
it's on the house because you've added that extra insurance out of your own pocket.
Yeah.
Now, it was originally not in your pocket until some smart legislation came through, or hopefully will come through according to this YouTube, but you know, that's what it's for. Among
Right.
other things, you can go a number of different ways with it. We were talking about the individual mandate. If you want to be a reckless individual and be, a weight on the system in terms of your emergency room visits that you don't have insurance for, then you know what? This is America. It's a free country. I suppose you're prohibited from going to the emergency room for free, but you shouldn't be. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say you don't get healthcare. It's hard to say that to people for a few reasons. One is that we care about those people and we don't want people to just die. They're still people.
I think so.
And then
Number one, right?
right, and
Thank
then
you.
and then another one is that if you let people be sick or unhealthy, that's bad for the people around them too.
No doubt.
So I think you're right that basic income helps in certain ways with healthcare. For example, we have this problem right now. If people have no money, you can't really charge them anything for healthcare. But with
You
basic,
can ask them to swipe a couple credit cards that they have on hand. But yeah, if you're dead broke and something horrible happens to
Right.
a child of yours, what are you gonna do? Patch them up yourself or take her into the hospital?
right?
You
So
don't have a choice as an American because you care about people in this country.
right. So I mean, there's this issue where now you're in a situation where where healthcare providers are providing healthcare for free to the people who can't afford it. But now there's an incentive problem with the patient where they might overuse the healthcare because they don't have to pay anything out of pocket. With basic income, that problem goes away because everyone has some amount of money. So you can charge a token amount just to help
or the
keep the
market
incentives
price,
up.
right? Like,
Uh,
how much are these surgeries going for?
It's hard to know.
It's too
Like
much,
in
isn't it?
healthcare, it's hard to know what the market price is. It's hard to even say. There's not like a
Do the
normal market
hospitals
pricing
themselves
mechanism.
even know what it costs to run an X-ray machine once or twice?
It
They don't
depends
even
what
know.
you mean by the hospital. I mean,
The
there are
management, it's all university.
Earlier this year, there
so-
actually was a law went into effect that the hospitals have to post their prices so that everyone knows about.
About time.
where is
How-
this?
It was a law that went into effect earlier this year.
Is
Here?
that federal or state?
No, federal.
Oh, interesting.
So
Oh.
is any
But
hospital doing it yet, or are they just pretending to?
Everyone's supposed to, but I'm not sure if they actually.
Like the percentage over under 15%, you think?
I don't know.
So that's interesting.
It's very interesting.
And it'd be interesting to see what that looks like.
Supposed to.
Well, it's interesting to see what that looks like because if there isn't this kind of normal market pricing mechanism and all of that, what do the prices mean and where are they going to come from? I mean, I think it was a great question. Like, do the hospitals even know what the price is? So I guess they're going to have to.
Probably not.
They're going to have to, if they're going to follow this regulation, they're going to have to figure out a way to know. So it's going to be interesting to see what that looks like. I hadn't heard about that.
It would be a logistical nightmare to do it across because if you think about it, each different hospital is good at one or the other thing. So when
Right.
you're good at heart surgeries, for example, my pop's got a heart surgery, and you do enough of them, you can drive the cost down because you know what you're doing. But the first ones are incredibly expensive. So if you have a hospital who's not good at that, but you have somebody who has the best insurance on the market, for example, because they paid out of their pocket or out of somebody else's pocket for good insurance, and therefore the hospital who's not good at it is going to charge them an arm and a leg. But they can do it. Now a hospital that's a big hospital, like, the Bronx, I'm sure they have a hospital that does everything. At that point, the cost is irrelevant because you're full service. So when you're full service, you just do what the patients come in with and you make them healthy. But when you're small potatoes, and a lot of these, you want to have good hospital systems and blah, blah, everywhere. You want as many hospitals you can build with your hands or your, dollar bill. But at the same time, you can't tell somebody just because they don't have the insurance doesn't mean they don't have a right to the surgery. You
Actually,
cannot.
in the
You
70s
cannot.
with Nixon, didn't want as many hospitals, so that's why
He was a
there's
putz. He liked war. He didn't like healing people. Richard
He
Nixon
would
went out going
prefer
like this.
HMOs.
What are HMOs? That's not a hospital. We need structures to care for human beings.
So I think
That's
we
an acronym, my friend, not an actual building.
could probably have an entire discussion about healthcare, and maybe we even have at one point. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I think we may have. But healthcare is just one of the aspects of this. So let's get to the article. I have a few quotes selected. So read the first one. For 40 years, Robert E. Friedman and his Washington-based nonprofit Prosperity Now have helped millions of people from economically vulnerable communities gain financial security and stability. Income disparity, however, has only grown across the United States. Now, the 69-year-old Friedman is arguing for a macroeconomic fix, and it doesn't involve the government just doling out cash. Instead, he advocates giving everyone assets like savings, education, home ownership, instituting a system of universal basic assets. And Friedman isn't alone. So this is interesting.
About the matching, about the savings,
Yeah.
the issue with that is that if you don't have enough money to match for a 401k, it's sort of like the employer matching. If you put $2,000 in the employer matches it with another $2,000.
Right.
If you don't have $2,000 to put into the 401k, then there's no way you can. It can't be matched.
Yeah.
Well, there's a financial term for that. I forget exactly the term, but it involves over a long period of time you're expected to experience some type of financial gain. I forget what the actual proper term for that is. It'll come to me eventually. But the point is, yeah, unless you got a pretty penny in there to begin with, it doesn't give you a appropriate, which is again not a financial term, but a term we use anyway. But it doesn't give you that appropriate return.
Yeah, so savings is really interesting, and obviously what you guys are talking about is some of the universal basic asset people advocate that you incentivize people to save by paying them to save, so it matches the money that they put in, that kind of thing. But savings is interesting because why do we do it? It's so we can get money out later. You know what else gives you money is basic income.
Mm-hmm.
So you can. I feel like there's
redundancy.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a problem they're trying to solve that is solved by basic income, and it's unclear that that incentivizing people to save money is a better solution to this problem, because ultimately what you want is people to be able to spend the money and to buy things from the economy. That's the whole point in the first place.
The whole reason for setting up the 401k in the first place is because the lobby is paying politicians to incentivize 401ks over pensions and things like that, because the pensions didn't provide like hedge funds and things like that as much money as people individually paying, because they have to pay like 2% on each year or something like that, versus a pension. It's a cumulative, like socialistic sort of thing where the fees are far less.
Like 1.5% or something?
Like with Vanguard, it's far less than.
It's practically free with Vanguard. They're doing great work.
So I mean, I think these are like minor details, but generally speaking, yeah, I mean, you do have pensions in a lot of places. There's still some pensions in the United States. There are some countries in Europe that have really high pensions, and that money is invested, usually in safer stuff. But yeah, maybe there's some, in terms of why we switched from pensions to 401k, there's some interesting incentives there. But I want to get back to this paragraph here. Do you have any thoughts, Bethany?
Well, I guess it just makes me think of another thing we haven't talked about why you would do something besides giving people money. I guess giving people money is kind of the baseline, it's the simplest thing. So you compare things to that, or I would.
Right.
And we talked about what's most efficient. We didn't talk about trying to incentivize particular behavior.
Right.
So that is another reason. So it seems like they're interested in particular, perhaps in incentivizing saving, incentivizing getting an education, incentivizing homeownership versus other kinds of things that you might spend the money on. And so I guess the question is, what are the costs and benefits of doing that?
Well, I had to jump in here because that is indeed the crux of the UBI debate, which is to say, are you going to have 20 million Americans who turn from hard-working citizens to folks who just fart under the covers all day? The answer to that question is maybe you might, or maybe you would see something good happen to the economy. Maybe you would see people that were maybe already in that position in their life have an opportunity to say, once the health insurance and the pension is taken care of, and again with the pension, the word we're looking for there is the time value of money. Because if you have an annuity worth nothing, time value of money is worth nothing. If you can take the money and again do productive things with it, get your savings in order, get your annuities in order in a bigger way, that time value of money starts working for you. But you could also say to somebody, haven't you always wanted to make your own food truck? Or haven't you always wanted to go to school and learn a specific type of thing, even if you don't know whether you're going to make a ton of money in that career? It gives people the opportunity to be creative. It lets people who want to explore and travel the world who might already have the means. And the most important thing, Alex, that you gotta remember is it doesn't incentivize folks not to work, because this thing's weighted on your income. It's not a pure $1,000 a month, as Andrew Yang's saying. It depends on whether you make a certain amount of money.
What does?
Rich UBI, I'm assuming. Because it's basic, but it's not that basic to the point where it's literally the exact same down to the penny. I mean,
exact same down to the penny as what?
Well, like if you make a certain amount of, this is for poor people. Like, let's be honest.
Universal basic.
This is not for rich people.
For poor people, yes. That's what it says.
We're not giving
You're talking about the UBA
get,
versus the UBI, right?
No. Well,
what are you
I'm talking about the guy who has a yacht. Okay.
So
are we giving him $1,000? Are you serious?
So yes. So let me
see. I think don't you think that's a little absurd? Because that incentivizes him to stay in his yacht and fart all day instead of go out and do something.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating.
Let's establish some definitions here of what we're talking about. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting hot over here.
So we're here to. So this is an introduction that I usually read at the beginning before we get on the live stream. We're here to talk about basic income. The term basic income can mean different things to different people. The broad definition of basic income that we use for this discussion is a regular income unconditionally paid to all members of a community.
Even yacht owners.
Even yacht owners, if they're members of the community.
I'm sorry, but that's rude, and that's.
Well, that's fine.
I'm
just talking about the definitions here, right? And then after we get through this, we can talk about what makes sense, right? So it doesn't have to be an amount that meets people's basic needs, though many members of this group believe that such an amount is achievable. It doesn't have to be paid out by a government, though many members of this group imagine that is likely to work this way. It doesn't necessarily correspond to a taxation system, though many members of this group believe that taxation is necessary to fund a basic income. The implementation of basic income doesn't necessarily imply anything about changes to other forms of government spending. The interval of the payout is unspecified, though many members of this group believe that a shorter interval is better. So basic income, as we kind of define it in this group, it does go to everyone, even yacht owners. So we can debate about whether that's a good idea or not. So a question that, well, the first question to ask is, what's the problem that basic income solves? Because I think the universal basic assets people are assuming that basic income is intended to solve a different problem than the one we usually talk about here. So the problem is that in order for the economy to function, people need money to spend in order to buy things. Like, we don't have a market economy if consumers don't have spending money. So basic income is a mechanism for getting money into the hands of consumers. And we can debate this too, but I would usually argue that it's a more efficient mechanism than creating jobs that are otherwise unnecessary in the economy. Than using the labor market is not meant to be a tool for funneling incomes to people. It's meant to be a market for getting people to do things. Does that make sense? So then the question is, if you need people to have spending money, what's the most efficient way to get it to them? And this is back to the yacht owner's question. The question is, if you give the same basic income to a yacht owner, how does that affect ordinary people? Is that good or bad for poor people?
I would say it's bad. Here's why. And I want to say this. These definitions are really making me think about how just complicated and nuanced this conversation topic is. But I'll say this again: this is for your working class folk. That's why we're at a round table right now having this discussion. Don't you think?
No, I don't think. And I actually am. So the question. So another question we can ask is why do we think of people as being a working class? So I think about like the economy exists for the benefit of the people.
Theoretically. In America.
Well, that's.
I mean, it depends on the
that's
jurisdiction.
why it exists. We can question how well it's serving that purpose. Yeah. So the economy exists for the benefit of the people. So that means the most important role that people play in the economy is as consumers rather than as workers, right?
It depends on your market, but
What do you mean?
Okay, here's the thing. The consumer, you want people to open up the marketplace, and you actually want more yacht owners. If all things are going right, you want more yacht owners, but that means you want to peel off more people from the UBI, because it's not for yacht owners. It's for people who want to aspire to be a yacht owner. It gives them an opportunity to make a smart savings bank investment, make a smart perhaps stock investment, or perhaps even.
So this sounds like a moral argument to me. Like, don't give it to yacht owners because they don't need it. I want to hear an economic argument. Why is it bad for people if yacht owners get the basic income?
Why? Say that again.
Why is it bad for people if
it's not bad
poor
for
people
the yacht owners because they have another.
Well, why is it bad for poor people if the yacht owners get a basic income?
I mean, it's not directly okay,
Sure,
but it is indirectly. It's incentivizing yacht owners to just fart and watch Netflix. And the thing is, we want yacht owners just like we want the working class folk to work and to labor for their returns.
So here's another question: why do we want people to work?
I mean, we want people to be occupied and busy, and we want people to feel like they're contributing, members of society and leading fruitful lives.
So it's an interesting question, right? Because we tend to expect three things from the labor market. One, efficient allocation of the resource of labor. Two, incomes for consumers. And then three, kind of meaning and purpose for workers.
I don't know if you've got that order just exactly right. And as a matter of fact, I think the meaning and purpose part, and I think that does tie into all of this, because when you say to somebody, hey, we're going to give you an opportunity to make a personal business move that you've been wanting to make for a long time, whether that means now you just have a little more money to donate to your favorite charity that you volunteer with and spend your time with, or whether it means you get together with a group of buddies and you open up a bed and breakfast and you make a little money off the Airbnb market. You steal that market from the corporations back to the people through what? Any mechanism you can, let alone one that's, so thought out as this, I would say.
So the question is, so we've got these three things that our society tends to expect from the labor market. And the question is, to what extent do we want to sacrifice efficient allocation of the resource of labor for incomes for consumers or for meaning and purpose for workers? Because I think it's important that people have incomes, and that can be solved through basic income. And it's important that people have meaning and purpose, but I don't think the answer for most people is to make up jobs for people to do and force them to do it. Well, and it's certainly not.
The government never ever should do that. Even if they tried, they probably couldn't do that unless you're talking infrastructure. But private business, you want to make private business in and of its own volition. And the one way to do that, to kind of quote unquote use a techie word to kind of hack through that problem, is you just provide a little liquidity, and Yang calls it quote unquote trickle up if you're paying attention. Other people call it, Milton Friedman economics. They've all MLK Jr. You name it. They understood that you give somebody a chance to just buy in who hadn't had that chance for whatever reason. Mommy, daddy had their problems, and you didn't have the money. It doesn't matter anymore because you have federal legislation that says, hey, you're an American and you may not be a yacht owner, but we're giving you a shot of, in this case, cold hard USD. And
right.
Hell, I'm not going to turn down. Government wants to give me, and again, I'm not making 50,000 right now ish, 51,000 or so, but government wants to pay me to get me jump started in this economy. I'm not saying no. Because it's not their right not to do that. That's why.
It's not their right not to.
Because they are responsible directly for
for messing up the middle class with the Reaganomics,
So-
and the Clintonomics, and all they could do is pay the man back. That's all they could do.
So
If you give it to everyone, it's just, including the Bill Gates of the world, there's
He does
less.
not get it. I'm sorry. Yacht owners and Bill Gates don't
So-
get it.
There's less. There's less stigma attached to it. The homeless person down the street getting it. If everyone gets it.
So I mean,
listen,
I mean that's
I think
true.
you're right, but I still don't care because I want the person on the street to feel like they're just as much an American as Billy Gates, and they're probably more of an American than Billy Gates if you actually look at a total sum of their behaviors. But what I'll say is this, man: what does a yacht owner gonna do with $1,000 except soup up their boat even more?
So actually, to be honest, the yacht owner is probably going to do nothing with $1,000.
How do you say that?
Well, he has a lot of money already, right? So if you give Bill Gates or a yacht owner something $1,000, it probably doesn't affect their behavior at
They
all.
probably
It
just
doesn't.
cut
It
it
just
straight to the
they just
charity,
ignore
honestly.
it, right? Maybe
If
put it
they're
to charity.
addicted, if Bill Gates actually does put half his dough in there, theoretically for Billy it'd be $500 a month to the Melinda and Bill Gates thing, straight off the top.
Right, but I mean,
if he weren't a punk,
from the perspective of the rest of the
all these CEOs, every single one.
so hey, we're not trying to get political in here. We're not trying to like necessarily morally judge anyone or any kind of business or anything. We're trying to understand. I'm not completely innocent of judging things. I'm judging universal basic assets. But
what's the difference at this point? People need
So-
their healthcare. People need their
yeah,
groceries, and
So-
and if they don't have housing, they need their fucking housing. And that's the first thing people talk about. Section 8. I don't care what section it is. I don't care what city it is. People get housing because this is America,
so
and we can build battleships that can fucking float without even touching the water. And
Okay.
you're telling me that we got people on the streets of this country just sleeping out here in 100 degrees with no AC? I'm sorry. Alex, I'm sorry. That's where UBI comes in, because it says even if you have decimated the middle class with your policies and not giving them a leg up and an opportunity to buy into it.
So Robert, what do you want out of the economy ultimately? What does a well-functioning economy look like to you?
I mean, I'm not the expert on it, but a well-functioning economy means that people are participating in it.
Participating in what sense?
Participating either as services, either as products, either as a consumer, either as a seller or a buyer, or just somebody
Okay.
who wanders the marketplace just seeing, how much is a carton of eggs going to cost me today, and how much sweat has to come off my neck before I can get it. And that's the question we're all trying to answer here. And when you give somebody an opportunity to make themselves an entrepreneur, which is essentially, you may as well call this the entrepreneur bill and call Yang the entrepreneur candidate. And because that's what this is. This is a modern day gig economy. Whether you like it or not, we're living in a gig economy. So let's give the citizenry a head start on it. A little line of credit from the feds.
So do you feel like there's a new problem that's occurring right now that makes basic income appropriate, whereas maybe it wouldn't have been 100 years ago or something like that?
The quote-unquote fourth industrial revolution. I mean, you
So you're
set
saying
me up
yes.
for that.
You're saying yes.
I'm saying hell yes, because
right.
the fourth industrial revolution.
So
that computer right
so
there
here's
is,
all right.
does the
I just
work.
wanted a yes. Okay. So the question is, was there ever a time when it was appropriate to use the labor market to force money to consumers, to create otherwise useless jobs to get money to people? Was that ever an appropriate thing to do? Was it ever appropriate to use the labor market as the way of getting people income?
If you're talking about the FDR policies, which the New Deal, I believe it was called, then the New Deal was useful because the New Deal helped cover for whatever financial treasonous fraud happened in the 1929 crash. Okay?
Yeah.
But we're not talking about 1930 or 31 or 40 or the Public Work Act. We're talking about 2019, Alex.
Well, we're talking
And
about
in 2019,
Hey.
that computer used to be the size of this room, huh?
Robert, we're not talking about 2019 in particular. We're talking about basic income in general, and that applies to all throughout history. Like, I mean, I would argue that a basic income would have been appropriate 200 years ago.
Well, you're probably
Actually,
right.
It probably actually was with the Spieldham.
Spieneland.
Yeah, Spieldham or whatever
Yeah.
experiment in England from like 1795 to 1838, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Listen, in terms of paper money, in terms of printing cold hard cash, that's about as American as Ben Franklin in Philly with a inkjet 2500. And unfortunately, it ain't year 200 BC, it's year 219 BC or AD. And because of that, we have to really realize money is about as liquid as it's ever going to be. It's never going to be more liquid than this, so let's do something with it.
It's never going to be any more liquid.
Listen, if I were the Federal Reserve and I had an opportunity
Yeah.
to do this, I had an opportunity to get ahead of this and say, we're going to find private companies to do this the right way and kind of manage it as a, I don't know, Chinese wall or whatever you want to call
Find
it.
private companies to do what the right way?
The hard coding of it.
Of a basic income?
Yeah.
Okay.
Be easy. I mean, it wouldn't be easy. It would take more than, Yang says he wants to do it on day one. Yeah, like that's fucking impossible. But I mean, it would take a lot of lawyers. It would take a lot of everything. But it could be done because, and I'm sorry for mixing up my, genres, but it could be done today because every transaction on your phone has a million things going on in the background. And
Yeah.
all you're doing is adding a million and one thing.
So
That's it.
yeah. So people do need money. I think the economy, the economy is not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy. And the economy has the capacity to do a lot better for people than it's doing right now. So basic income, especially if you calibrate it to the level of consumer spending that the economy can actually sustain, that can help maximize the benefit that people get from the economy. Now, I think, that is ultimately what basic income is and the problem that basic income solves.
Theoretically, again, according to many entrepreneurs, according to many prominent, how many academics have come out in favor of this? Probably a few.
In 1971, there were over 1,000 economists that supported the basic income bill, or FAP, as they
Again,
call
Nixon is
I think-
the one who, it was called FAP, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Family assistance plan.
It was called, and what was the USD per annum amount on
It
that?
was about $6,000 per year.
So that's half of
current
what-
dollars.
In current
in
dollars.
2019
Yeah.
bills.
Mhm.
We should make this thing way more than we are if that was what they were thinking then. I agree he was kind of a messed up
So,
president. I agree with myself
we
that he
don't-
was a messed up president, but he's right on that.
We don't know what the
Surprising.
we don't know what the optimal level of basic income is for the economy. Like, we don't know how high you could ramp it up before we start seeing problems.
How do you mean that?
Huh?
Okay, I'm going to just pose a general
Yeah.
question. If it's good some of the way, wouldn't it be good all the way?
Well, what ends up happening is if you set the basic income too high, like if you set it to, $100,000 a year for every
Well,
American.
that does disincentivize people from working at that point.
Well, any level
I'm
of
not taking a job. If you give me $100,000, I'm going to Vegas.
well, that's yeah.
in
So that's
5 minutes.
so disincentivizing a job is
I'm
just
sorry,
is
that's
just
the truth.
part of the issue. So ultimately, what it does is it causes consumer spending to exceed the actual level of production in the economy. And that's partly because the level of production can only go so high, and it's partly because you're giving people so much money that they're working less, and we need that labor in order to produce. We're actually producing less. So what you're going to end up seeing if you have a basic income of $100,000, for example, is you'll see inflation in prices, right? Because people won't be able to buy as much stuff with the money. So you'll see a period of inflation until the inflation brings prices down, or brings consumer purchasing power back down to a level that the economy can productively sustain. So ideally, you wouldn't want to set the basic income too high because you don't want to cause inflation, and you'd get that kind of disruption there. But you'd want to set it as high as you could without causing inflation.
So if you start out with $12,000, next year you might try $13,000 if people aren't disincentivized, and then 14, 15, and then you keep going until you reach a number that people start being their habits start getting, their working habits start getting altered by it.
So
Well, listen,
So-
in the scientific world, that's called the quote-unquote guess and check method, which is to say you can tweak
Right.
this, but
yeah,
what
so
you
it's
want is you want to
an
build that
algorithm,
into the
right? Yeah, you want to build the algorithm.
But
You want to have an
before-
algorithm for it.
You want to have this
So-
thing so locktight that it's like, how much data do you think? How much data do you think the Treasury and or the Federal Reserve go through on a daily basis? Like,
It's a lot. Yeah.
I mean,
And
and they're doing worldwide stuff. They're doing Chinese. They're doing everything.
we do have the macroeconomic indicators to be able to make these kinds of tweaks and adjustments until we get it to the optimal level. We're going to be able to do that if we wanted to.
Well, you need
Right.
to bring in third-party private companies that can basically say, listen, we know that, here's a great example of this. Great example. The feds basically invented email, but then they said, you know what? We're the feds, we're good at collecting taxes, but we're really not good at anything else. So we're going to dole this out to private companies. What happened? American companies now dominate email, and they also dominate the rest of the interwebs because the Fed said, listen, we're good at certain things, we're good at analyzing data, we're really good at printing money, we're even better at collecting money come springtime. If you made it in this country, if you're a hooper, if you're an entrepreneur or a high flying, the CEO at my family's hometown grocery chain got busted with like $1 million cufflinks and private jets and stuff like that. That, you know, them's the people, I guess they get it too. And I'm losing my train of thought here on it, but the point of the story is this: you always want to have partnerships, because the more people you get in on it, in terms of the more ideas that are at the table, the more thinking you can do about this marketplace that you want to quote unquote optimize, the better you're going to be.
So this is an interesting question between, what the balance should be between, public, government doing stuff, and then what should be managed kind of like by private companies and stuff like that.
90-10 if you can figure it out, because basically you need the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the legislative to be on board. You don't even need the executive branch, which is ironic that it's going to be Yang who's pushing it as the quote unquote bully pulpit. But what you need is as many quasi-private public partnerships as you can get, because then when you start talking about trickle up economics, and that is kind of the issue on the table, and you say, let's get real people who are going to be their neighbors, their cousins, their friends, their colleagues. Everybody's going to be involved in this. So we want people to say, yeah, my company has some of the back end technology on this, and it better fucking be right, Like, we don't have time.
So we're talking about public-private partnerships.
Pardon my language, Alex.
Can you say more about
So, things that the economy needs, that society needs, and the government partnering with private companies to make it happen.
How does that usually work? I guess I don't know.
Oh, I can draw a diagram. I actually saw a video about this yesterday.
Oh, cool.
Well, here is it's all public. This is all public, and so all the dollars are disconnected and whatever. And over here on this side is communist, where
Wait. We're not talking about commies. We're talking about UBI. So let's
and
just slow down,
here
please. What's going on?
And over here is a socialistic thing where some things.
Which one's
are
America, for God's sake?
Over here is and then some things are not owned by the government. It's a public partner. And over here is a democratic socialist sort of thing, where some.
I think he's just drawing different options or different things at different places.
So he's just establishing what kind of the spectrum is.
Mm-hmm.
Which one's America?
And right here is this is America right here. This is democratic.
So this is like Sweden and Norway, and this is America, right? That makes sense.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question.
Alex, I'm gonna refill this.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. I would put it there.
So it's an interesting question, how much stuff should be managed by the markets and how much stuff should be managed by the government. And I think that comes back to kind of like the core of universal basic assets.
Right.
And something I wonder about is whether universal basic assets is really a new thing, or whether it's just kind of a reframing of the question of how much should be managed by the government. And they're kind of playing on the universal basic income name in order to kind of like draw attention to this, and maybe they're emphasizing that more things need to be managed by the government or something like that.
And actually, the whole thing about home ownership is that in Germany they actually incentivize rentership instead, where they want more people to rent things instead of own them.
There's different reasons to do either one. There are people who like renting because of the conveniences. Then there are people who like owning because of the potential to, sell her down the line when the values go up. There's
Yeah,
different
I mean,
reasons
I
for
think
each.
the markets are such that it balances out. The people who are expected to benefit the most from ownership are the ones who own, and the people who are expected to benefit the most from
But I
renting
guess
are the ones
this
who
is
rent.
But in America, we incentivize homeownership through like tax benefits
Right.
and things like that, and which makes greater disparities between the poor and the rich, because the rich are more likely to benefit from mortgage deductions and things.
Yeah, so I think this changes the incentives. Anytime we have a policy in place to encourage one thing over another, it like we're trying to incentivize home ownership, so it kind of pushes things in that direction. It's an interesting question, and I feel like so we look at savings, education, home ownership. My feeling is that home ownership is something that you could decide how you want to manage your housing, and just giving people money for that, like flexible money, allows them to make that decision.
You mean just giving them a
Like a basic income, yeah. Whereas if you're trying to kind of lock people into homeownership, how do you even manage that? Like do you just give them money that they're only allowed to spend on homes, or that kind of thing? I mean, we can trust people that they're gonna pay for housing for themselves.
But you have to realize,
yeah.
Alex, for Section 8 stuff, if you're going to do
I'm not talking about
8,
Section 8.
But if you're going to do it, this is not UBI, but if you're going to do it, you got to do it right. Don't you agree?
I mean, I think if you want to do anything, you should do it right. We're not talking about Section 8 right now.
The way we're currently with like Section 8 and things, most people qualify for. A lot of people qualify for it, but few people actually receive the benefit for it.
Is that right?
Interesting.
Yeah, because there's such a wait. You have to wait a really long time, or that's
and
part
it
of
has
it.
far fewer resources than it should be allowed if you're going to fulfill the mandate of the bill.
Right. The number of people who qualify is way higher than the amount of housing available for them. Yeah.
Your mom kind of is pointing out something related to this, which is that UBA is kind of a way to maintain or augment a lot of the programs that already exist.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. So UBA seems to me to be like a way of kind of creating more of these programs, and it's like a framework for thinking about it, and why we're doing it and that kind of thing.
That's a good point.
So for home ownership, I feel like that can be handled by basic income. Savings, again, I feel like you don't need to incentivize people to save. All you need to do is make sure that they have enough money, and a basic income can do that. There's nothing you can do with savings that you kind of can't do with basic income. As far as education goes, I think this is I think it's important for the government to support education, but again, we think of education in our society as preparing people for jobs, and I don't think that's the healthiest way to think about education.
That's a thoughtful idea, but if you're not going to use education to prepare people for jobs, what do you intend? What's the best case scenario for a kid who goes to Harvard and wants to learn about anything in the world? But they know that when they get out of that, it is the real world still.
It is the real world still, but it would be nice if, so I mean, the current status quo, I would argue, is that we have this system where we're creating jobs for people, unnecessary jobs, and forcing them to work in order to earn the money. Now, if you don't think, I like to say that nobody has a right to a job, nobody has a right to earn anything or something like that. But if you want an efficient labor market that allocates labor efficiently, then the labor market is just a market for getting people to do things. So it's not about benefiting the workers in some way or something like that. It's just you pay people only enough to get them to do the thing you want them to do. And that's what the labor market is for, and that's what it's best at. So if you end up having a situation where the economy is such that we need a lot of people doing a certain kind of job and no one is trained for that job, and no businesses or anything are training people for that job, but they would hire the people if they were trained or something like that, then you can kind of intervene with some sort of job training program or something like that. The government can intervene. But generally speaking, as far as education goes, it's not about preparing people for jobs. It's about kind of enriching people's lives and preparing them to get the most out of this experience.
I think, and here's another thing.
Yeah.
I think that, first of all, that analysis of yours is just like it's like so thoughtful that it's almost hard to follow entirely, and I mean that so complimentary. So I appreciate this whole thing. But when I think about education, I think about there are things you learn, whether it's in your lower school or your higher school. There are things you learn that are priceless. So who's getting those things? Normally, middle class people. What you want is people who might have that mental aptitude. They might not have that mental aptitude, but they might, and they might have even more mental aptitude. So what you want to do is say, no matter what you were born into, and there are different ways, there are a lot of different ways to open up education, no doubt. But UBI is one that says, hey, I can now put down the 300 on the Coursera class that, like, you know,
Right.
I'm in Harvard, but this guy out at Stanford is like making this great teaching or whatever. And like, you can get a lot of that for free 99 in 2019, but you can get a lot more if you just put down 100. You can get a certification, you can get whatever, and you
Yeah.
can become an expert in any field, whether you're enrolled in school or not.
So-
and it just goes to show you, education is the real deal.
So I mean, I think a lot of what you're saying is right, and that it makes sense that we would want to ensure that everyone has access to like really high quality education, no matter what their background is. I think that's super important. I do want to kind of like, I think people would benefit more from the education if it wasn't just trying to like steer them into this labor market machine, especially when a lot of times we don't necessarily need the workers, we don't necessarily need the labor. We're just kind of
perpetuating our standards and our kind of normal way of doing business. But the thing is, what colleges are just a couple years behind in is that some are not. You know, the liberal arts schools are always going to be great at culture and creativity and arts, and it's a blessing that they are, and it's a blessing that the money's still there to do that. We want more money to do that. But the places, you know, that are just sending kids to B school to pick up, you know, K201 and like, you know, Excel, if you're in a corporate gig, you better know that stuff. So like you kind of have to take it. But the chances of you landing the corporate gig where you need it like so much that you have to, like, you couldn't possibly miss it, then it's like, all right, well, that's not gonna be everybody. It's just not, because fourth industrial revolution, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually a little bit skeptical of the whole fourth industrial revolution thing. I think, you know, certainly we do have technological advancement that's accelerating, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, you've probably heard of the idea of a federal jobs guarantee.
It's bullshit.
Yeah, but it's not only bullshit, it's standard bullshit, right? It's a continuation of what we're already doing.
It's more of the same.
It's more of the same, and it's what we've been doing for a long time. So it's not like we're suddenly reaching a point where we can't do that anymore. We can keep it going as long as we want. We can continue to make up jobs for people and force them to work.
But
so
Alex, here's the thing, from a logical standpoint, like that's a bulletproof argument.
Yeah.
But then you say, all right, we know that jobs are bad government policy because it's a stupid thing and a waste of everybody's time. But we know that, like,
not a lot of people
bridges
know that.
and roads and highways that like everybody uses every day are really good things.
Yeah.
And again, friend, this is where these things come into play, because if you say, hey, I'm the feds, I want to put $1 trillion into something because I can, and I'm going to put it through contractors, subcontractors, private, public, et cetera, partnerships. And again, Sweden's over here, the commies over there, the feds are right in the middle, and that's a good thing, because while the fed's not creating jobs, the public are getting big time infrastructure services. Like they put roundabouts in my hometown, and like that costs a ton of money up front, ton of time, gives you a few jobs.
So Robert, I would encourage, of course we need infrastructure. We need lots of investment in infrastructure. But at the same time, when we're building the infrastructure, wouldn't we want to use as little labor as possible to do that? Because otherwise you're wasting people's time.
Well, you want to use big time machinery because you want to use big time building blocks. But in terms of the hands on deck, Alex, I'm afraid you want as many, pieces of the pie to be doled out as possible. And a good contractor has to obviously manage the books and the budget, and you can't have 20 guys on a site that requires 3.
Right.
But like,
so
at the end of the
question
day,
is,
you want 10 or so out there just to make sure nothing goes wrong.
So the question is, if you're looking at a project, and there's a bullet point, creates X number of jobs. Should we think of that as a good thing? Should we think of, this project creates jobs? Okay, that's an argument in its favor, or is it just, why do we want?
I think an analogy
Yeah.
maybe for how Alex sees this is that, if you're thinking about your own housework, like you definitely want to get your dishes done, but you want to get them done as quickly as possible. It wouldn't be like advantageous to say, and it'll take up 3 extra hours of your time.
You're wasting
you've got,
water at that point.
exactly.
but
So,
like-
so I think,
And that's a really good analogy, because when we create jobs, we are wasting resources. And one of those resources is people's time. When you create unnecessary jobs,
when
right?
you create unnecessary, right?
Like
have
you
to-
don't
have
want
to
to you don't want
qualify
to
it.
be in your house with your family and saying, chores are just really good. We want to create as many as possible, even if it doesn't get more housework done.
You,
right?
you want jobs to be meaningful. You want jobs to be something that
efficient,
is.
yeah.
Do we care? Should we care about jobs being meaningful?
Well, I don't know if he means to the
Well, that's
individuals.
an
I think he
esoteric
means,
question. Of
like,
course, you should care about jobs being meaningful, because you should care that somebody feels that their occupation gives them self-worth. Now,
So,
if they don't have an occupation
reason-
that pays private dollars, this UBI lets them get into that game some way, shape, or form.
So certainly we want to live in a world where people have meaning and purpose in their lives, right? Like that's so obvious and important, right? Well, I mean, ultimately we care about people. We want people to be living their best lives.
That's the point of good economics, as you said.
Yeah, that is the point of good economics. And the question is the labor market, are jobs the mechanism by which we should be providing that for people?
It's one of many things, as you can see.
So it's one of many things. But if you start with a default of people have the freedom to live their lives a certain way, they have a certain amount of money, their lives are at a certain level, then you have.
It's called a sense of abundance. Is the word that kind of explains what it would feel like to be untethered from the financial constraints of the fourth industrial revolution. But in terms of like what percentage of it should be just pure infrastructure, as many thousands of jobs you can create, versus what section of it should be, let's see if we can't get this marketplace humming a little more effectively and see what kind of path that leads to. It's just going to be somewhere in betweens. And the reason it's going to be somewhere in between is because A, no one can predict the future. B, we don't know what the right dollar amount is. It's double what it was in 1970 and 2019 dollars, but we still don't know if that's right because it never happened in the first place. But what you want is people to be occupied. And you can define occupied in any manner you want. Some people consider it their occupation to be an artist. That doesn't make you a lot of dough, does it, Alex?
So the question is, we do want people to be occupied, have meaning and purpose. The question is, what's the most efficient way to provide it for them? Certainly, most of the jobs that exist in our economy are not the kinds of things that people go in there and they feel like, wow, this is really like allowing me to be my full self, that kind of thing. It's usually, the jobs are not designed to make people happy. They're not like we've adapted to enjoy certain things in our lives, even certain forms of work and stuff like that. The jobs that exist, most of the ones in the economy, they don't play to those adaptations. They don't activate.
Well, if you're an employer and you got a private shop and you got 200 people on the payroll and you got 500 other line items that you're worried about, it gets tight. And you're certainly not paying somebody to sit on the computer all day on Twister and keep themselves busy. You're paying somebody to contribute value to your bottom line so that you stay in the black and you don't go in the red.
I mean, I think that's right. So the question is, what is the mechanism that we should use to help support people in having meaning and purpose and being occupied? And a lot of people think that kind of it goes hand in hand with jobs, that it's the same thing. But if we were really using jobs for that purpose, these wouldn't be the jobs we would be creating.
If
You know what I
have a
mean?
Basic income,
I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I mean,
if you have a basic income, there are people.
Yeah, I know.
If you gave them $12,000 a year, they wouldn't work in fast food or whatever. They would have to pay more than say the $15 per hour for the Fight for 15 thing, and they would have to pay $20 or $25 or whatever because they didn't want to put up with the indignities of people yelling at them for things that they can't control or whatever.
now I'll tell you this: there are going to be some folks who prefer farting under the covers and watching TV to laboring for $15 an hour.
So the question
once they know
is,
that they can do that. But the question isn't whether or not they can or cannot do that. The question is, how many of them will, and are there enough Americans who want to take that money, put it all away,
So
keep working, let that.
the question
and
is
again, it's
not
time value of money.
So the question is not how many of them will kind of sit around doing nothing. The question is what's the level of basic income we can achieve such that there's a balance.
Probably $1,000 a month.
Well, it's unlikely to be 1,000 a month, but you're not any amount of unconditional money that you give people is going to disincentivize people from working.
Theoretically.
Yeah. So the
Hypothetically.
higher the amount, the more the incentive for people to look for different jobs, spend their time more in the way they want to be spending their time. That kind of
I
thing.
think honestly, I think that's a very, very insightful sentiment, because that's what I would do with my time. Is I would be able to travel more, be able to take a more expensive vacation if time permitted, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to go quit my day job.
So then there are two questions. One is, what do we want out of people? And then the second question is, are people behaving in ways that are harming themselves and making themselves miserable?
Working 3 jobs ain't easy, and probably means you're smoking nicotine and taking cigarettes and maybe something else on the side just so that you can make it to round 3, you know?
Right. So
that's not good. It's not healthy, and that puts more stress on the hospital.
So those two questions again are, what do we want out of people? And then how do we make sure that people aren't harming themselves? How do we support them in not engaging in self-destructive behavior?
You'll put one here, Stephen, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you take a swing here, buddy? Be quiet for me.
So I think the answer to the first question is that the labor market is a market. So we can allow it to incentivize the amount of work it needs to incentivize. If there's a higher basic income, that might mean you need to pay people more to do certain jobs. It may mean you don't need to pay people as much to do improve people's lives, and we want it to be functioning as well as possible. So basic income is necessary for the market economy to function, and then the market economy, the whole point of that is kind of ultimately to make people happy.
And it's to let people know that when you're in a free country, the market economy is the be all end all. And the thing about a good market economy, when it is functioning, when it is making people happy, it means more people are in it. That's all. It means that now let's say we have 300 so million Americans. How many people every day are really in the economy? Most of them. Does UBI give us a real quorum there? Sure it does. And that's, again, when we're talking, these terminologies that we use, the public-private partnerships, the infrastructures, all these things get buoyed when you do smart legislation somewhere else.
Yeah. So I want to get to Hortster's comment. He says, or she, I don't know, says, many social programs are set up to promote the goal of full employment in the economy. However, we should be trying to reimagine the relationship between capital and labor. And UBA would help with that. I think he's right that a lot of programs are set up to promote the goal of full employment. And then the question is that a reasonable goal? Do we care, why do we care about keeping everyone working? And I would say that this is not the kind of goal that we should be shooting for. And in terms of reimagining the relationship between capital and labor, you're still thinking about things from the production side of the economy. Capital is used to produce things. Labor is used to produce things. And the point of UBI in particular, it's not about the production, it's about the consumption. It's about giving people the means to consume the benefit that the economy is providing for them. So I don't know in what sense it sounds like and in the article too, it sounds like UBA is more oriented toward the production side of the economy, which I always frame as being secondary to the consumption side, because the whole point is that people consume, people need the benefit, and the production is there to serve that. The consumption comes first.
That people should be considered producers rather than consumers.
I saw that quote. So before we move on to the next
what do you mean
quote,
people should be considered producers?
It's just a quote.
We'll get to it in a second, or in a few minutes. Before we get to the next quote, I want to ask just Bethany and Steve if you guys have any comments either on this or on anything in the discussion, and then we'll move on to the next quote.
I guess, did we already cover exactly what his plan is?
So-
I had that question.
Who's?
No, we're
The-
still
Robert
on
E.
the first,
Friedman.
the opening paragraph.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought we were looking at a different doc that I like. Can we bring up the doc, if it's all right, of the intro speech that we did a little bit late today? The regular old what the definitions were that were the kind of presumptions that we're taking here.
That was just the definition of basic income.
But could we, for the people, could we take it one more time? Just because I think that's
Yeah.
a nice informative document that says
So
kind
it's-
of what are the ground rules or the structures of the
Right.
debate.
So
essentially.
it's a regular income unconditionally paid to members of the community. So that's what we mean when we talk about basic income or universal basic
I
income.
see.
And here in this particular, we have a different subtopic each time. So our subtopic this time is to contrast with the idea of something called universal basic assets, which is instead of giving people money, you're giving people other things.
You're giving them property.
You're giving them property. It's really, really broad. So like we saw that education and home ownership and savings were all part of it. You know, financial assets can be part of it. I've even seen definitions of universal basic assets where the basic income is one of the assets under the umbrella. And I thought that was interesting.
Which was that? Which designation was that? Who did the?
Pardon?
You said there was an umbrella idea where they basically made one of the things a subsidiary of the other.
So yeah, so UBA is kind of an umbrella of all these different things that you could provide them, provide people. And some people include under that umbrella the idea of basic income as one of the assets that you would provide people.
So basically, there's $1,000 a month for everybody, and then there's maybe for people who really, really need it most, housing, or people needed education.
Yeah, I mean, we don't define basic income here as $1,000 a month. It could be any amount.
Okay, that's right. It's not-
Yeah, but I think what these guys are arguing is that there are certain things we need to provide for people directly. We need to target it specifically. I agree with education that that's something that that the government should have a hand in providing for everyone, or we need to kind of collectively make sure that everyone's getting a really good education.
Most countries are doing that.
Most countries are doing
We
that.
look stupid.
Right. So I agree with education. I don't agree with homeownership because I feel like that's something that people will naturally be able to buy with their money if they have the money. And then savings is the same thing. You're giving people money, but in kind of this backwards way. We don't need people to save more money. We just need them to be able to spend at levels that benefit themselves, that kind of thing.
But doesn't savings still offer you the benefit of saying, if I'm really smart, because this gives, like I said, this gives opportunities for people who might be good in the financial markets but never had a chance.
Sure.
And if you get a like let's say they did this 20 years ago and you put it all on Apple stock, you'd be a millionaire. And this allows this bill overnight, no matter whether
What bill?
The UBI bill.
UBI, right? So
It's going to make
so this is
millionaires
talking about
overnight.
UBA, right? It's talking about like so when they talk about savings here, they're talking about giving people money specifically to incentivize more savings. I don't know that you need to do that. I think if you just give people the basic income, then they can save that money, according to their desires and that kind of thing.
Again, the UBA problem gets sorted out if you have numerous public-private partnerships. The more numerous public partnerships you have, the better the UBI is going to be, because there's going to be a plethora or a Pandora's box worth
Pandora's
of
box.
opportunities for
So,
people. Some will be financial,
I mean-
some will be charity-based.
So yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question, to what extent things should be provided by the public sector, the private sector, or public-private partnerships. We did have a discussion on kind of capitalism versus socialism and everything in between as one of our discussion groups. So
That's
you might want to
very
check out that
interesting.
video.
I will.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Bethany, do you have any more comments?
That's okay. We can go to that.
Okay, Steve.
Nope. Go
All right,
ahead.
we're gonna go to the next quote now.
Alex, when you say the capitalist versus socialist, do you think that breaks out? Would you consider UBA more socialist and UBI more capitalist if you had to pigeonhole them in either one, or is it not that clear of a delineation?
Well, I think there always needs to be there's some things that are provided directly by the government or public-private partnerships, and then some things that are allocated just by the free market. UBI is the thing that funds the free market. It gives people money to spend so they can buy things, and then the incentive, then the firms and everybody competes for the business of consumers and that kind of thing. So I'd say that UBI is the free market side of things, but you do need both sides.
Semi-capitalist, but socialist in the sense that
Right.
it cares about human beings who are social creatures.
Right. I think in that sense,
Human
we all care
focused
about that all the time.
capitalism.
Human-centered
Human,
capitalism.
whatever.
Yeah, that's is that a Yangism?
That
It's
is a Yangism.
He
Yeah.
got no. His thing is his slogan is humanity first, and
Well, he's got a lot of Yangisms.
whether you
Yeah.
want to designate this as a certain type of politics or a certain type of fiscal policy, the bottom line is the middle classes, the working classes, and pretty much other folks too get just a little bit of a refresh button on where they're at. And for many people, it won't make a ding. But for other people, this will be a life changer. And like I said, if this had happened when certain stocks were trading below 100 and you happen to just put a few of them down, you have an opportunity now to do what people who had that wealth already did. And that is what a free market, I should say, American market permits its citizens is A, a fair shake, B, a deck of cards in a hand at the table in the game. Because why else do you want to be a citizen here? Why are there 2,000 people at the border every day? Because it's already good without this. Wait till you get this. You're going to have half of South America and Antarctica coming up here.
Well,
that's a fact.
I think some of that is moral arguments, and actually, an interesting fact is that I think the net migration between the United States and Mexico, and not a lot of people realize this, but it's actually there are more people going from the United States to Mexico than there are from Mexico to the United States. And that's been true for a number of years.
Because their dollar goes so far there compared to the peso.
That's part of it, right? But I think the people, anyone who's moving is moving because they feel like they would be better off in the other place. So the people going to Mexico feel like they'll be better off in Mexico. The people going in
beaches are
or
nice.
the people going to the United States think they're going to be better off in the United States. That kind of thing. So it's just an interesting
have a
thing.
Actually,
Yeah.
in the
Did we read this quote yet, or
We haven't read this quote yet.
actually, a lot of people come to the United States from Mexico because the border wall actually locks them in because they don't want to have to cross the border again.
Locks who in?
Locks people who would rather go back to Mexico or Guatemala. Or
They get over here and find out, I can't even get a fresh shower here until I get my visa checked in 90 days. Yeah, it's a raw deal.
No, it's because
It used to be a good deal, before the government got tight at the border, and that's partially Texas's fault for misallocating the oil money, but it's also the feds who are just in this day and age, in the era of machismo, like they're rude to immigrants.
So what were you going to say, Richard?
it's because before border walls and things like that, they were easily able to go across the border each day for like work visas and things like that.
Maybe drug running too. And
But because of the wall, it's a lot harder to cross back and forth, and so that people are 12 million or whatever immigrants would rather stay here than have to bother going back across the wall.
This is a chore.
Yeah.
The wall's stupid. I mean,
So-
the wall's an excuse to say to the people of Texas, nobody's going to take your jobs, and the people of Texas are happy to hear that. They're happy to hear they're safe. But
I think it would be great if we weren't worried about people taking jobs because we weren't worried about jobs anymore. That would be fantastic.
So
But let me get to the quote.
In the
Then you have
quote-
100 million people.
So I'm
here
gonna
in
get to
2030.
this next quote now. So
You know it.
Friedman began comparing UBA and UBI concepts as the latter entered public discourse in recent years. Friedman, a fourth-generation San Franciscan, found himself asking, "Why are we treating low-income people as consumers rather than producers? Basic assets," Friedman suggests, "provide stock so you have a buffer if things go wrong." Bethany.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that with money, you can certainly easily buy something like stock. So the reason that someone with a universal basic income wouldn't buy stock would be that they had other more important, more urgent things to spend it on. So if you give people stock instead, they're either going to sell it right away and use it for those things, or if you don't let them do that, they're going to be worse off by definition because they otherwise could just buy that stock.
So I don't know that he's using the word stock in
sorry.
the sense of like the stock market. I think he means stock as in like wealth, the assets that you
for
hold.
Or like
many,
seeds
for
for
many
like
of those
farms
kinds
and
of things, that would still, what I said would still be
Well,
relevant.
stock, if you're talking
Yeah.
about,
I think
if
what you're
talking about
saying,
cattle, that's one
excuse me,
thing.
Robert.
Sorry.
So for many of the things for many of the things that he might be talking about, my argument would still be relevant.
Yes, and I think that's right. I think if you give people money, they can use that money to buy whatever assets they want.
or not buy whatever assets
or
they
not-
don't
Right.
want.
or not buy whatever assets they don't want. And there's a lot more flexibility there. I think, managing assets is a tricky thing, and different kinds of assets are, managed in different ways, and different people prefer to invest in different things and all of that.
As Rob said, some people
Yeah.
prefer the convenience of renting, some people prefer things about buying a house. So if you force
Right.
them to do one or the other, it's not so
And it
Right.
also depends on where
So-
you're starting at. Because, the yacht guy doesn't need more parcels of land, so he's just going to hold it or give it to charity or buy another stake. And then the regular person's going to probably, first thing, groceries, second thing, medicines, third thing, apartment, and then a savings account if you have time. And then you send the kid to college. So all these things are good. All these things are,
Right.
it's not chattel, it's not true property, but it is tender currency.
Yeah, and I think that's right.
Promissory note, basically.
And something that's interesting here is because he's complaining that we're treating low-income people as consumers rather than producers. But I think that's exactly what we want. We want not just to treat low-income people as consumers, but to treat all people as consumers. And the producers are there to serve the consumers.
Yeah.
The consumer is the primary role that people play in the economy. And the
And again,
UBI
this could
funds
be
that.
Media, arts, culture.
Sure.
Like,
And-
it's infinite number as we have up here on the wall.
We have this kind of moral feeling in our society that we want people to participate in production or share in the means of production and that kind of stuff. But I think the whole reason we have these feelings is because we're used to thinking of, well, if you're participating in the production, that's how you get access to consumption. So if with a basic income, it breaks that tie. So you can have money and spend money and receive the benefit without necessarily forcing people to kind of like come up with some way to get people to give them money or something like that.
Well,
Yeah.
but again, on one hand, yeah. On the other hand, again, you're gonna have. Let's say this was distributed to everybody that's what if it's 18 or 21, and you're gonna find that overnight there's gonna be millions of people who are now considering entrepreneurship but weren't before, because
Yeah.
they're gonna say, now I have the ability to go, put clothes on my child, and I got that taken care of. I can think about what I'm good at, what I might want to be a producer at. And if I really want it bad enough to get out from under the covers where I've been farting and watching TV and enjoy my humanity as an American. And that's a privilege to be able to have that liberty, that freedom, that possibility of getting I hate to sound so damn cheesy, but a piece of the American pie, man.
Yeah. So it's, there's how do you ensure that everyone has access to a piece of the American pie? And then how do you ensure that the pie is actually as large as it can be? Because, if people don't have spending money, the economy is going to underproduce.
Which is where we're at today.
Right. That's where we're at today. And the pie could potentially be a lot larger. It's a lot easier to give people a decent sized slice if you've got a bigger pie.
It's the
so-
number of ways it could go. Like, just think about like the yoga studios and like the food trucks and like the bodegas and like all these people who we have a lot of them right now. We don't have nearly as many as we could or should. You could have people who are private entrepreneurs who say, I want to specialize in Dijon mustard. They have some of those shops in New York, but they don't have them on Main Street in Tuscaloosa, Wisconsin, because there's not enough entrepreneurial spirit there, because there's not the cash flow. They don't have the lines of credits. You go to the bank, you better know the best real estate agent ever.
I mean, I think this is all true. I think if you give people more freedom to spend their time how they choose, and that means having the money to not have to
business risks.
Right, to take business risks, that kind of thing. It does unlock a lot of potential, but we're still, even when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about it from the production side. And it's not that the production side is unimportant, but I think there's kind of a lot of potential that can be unlocked on that side, because there are plenty of people who are stuck doing things that are much less useful to society than what they would be doing if they had the freedom to do what they wanted. So I think that's a huge thing. But I also think with basic income,
well, again, there's a possibility that people will become less useful to society too, just because there's some folks who have that lazy gene. But the thing is, what you'll do is you'll take a couple folks, turn it onto the lazy side of things, for the mother of three who's trying to just take care of them and doesn't have the time in the day to go have a third job. So what you want is, there are people who are worthy and deserving of every bit of this and then some. and then there are people who might not be. But guess
Well,
what? If
what-
you're an
And there's
So
American,
you can ask-
there's
you
a
can ask-
Buckminster Fuller quote that one person can produce enough for 10,000 people.
Right.
well,
So-
that's trash. Who's Buckminster Fuller?
Right.
I'm dead serious. One person's not going to be able to make enough pancakes that all 10,000 of them get a crepe unless they got the most deluxe Belgian waffle.
So
maker you ever
he was
shipped
actually talking about like innovation. Like there are these
Oh,
things.
that's-
There are
no doubt
these.
about it. Big Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
How many
so
millions
so
of these
so
things
anyway,
are in the universe now?
if you have a basic income, you can imagine that the size of the effect is greater if you have a larger basic income. But you can imagine that some people would the new freedom that they have would inspire them to do amazing new things, innovation, that kind of stuff. And then you can imagine other people, the new freedom they have, they would go home and be lazy and stuff like that. But I wouldn't.
Negligible is the term.
It's not about whether it's negligible or not. We would tune the amount of the basic income to the optimal level so that you'd have the right balance. But the people who are lazy, who had the lazy gene or whatever you said, it's actually potentially more beneficial to the economy for those people not to be in the labor market, competing for jobs with people who actually are interested in doing the job, that kind of thing.
I like that quote.
Yeah.
Like with someone who has which burger would you rather get? Someone who has a gun to their head and they're told flip a burger, flip these burgers, or someone who's a gourmet chef and they want to have they want the finest ground beef and whatever, and their only satisfaction and payment they want is to have someone smile for them. Which burger would you have, the gun to their head or the person who wants to smile?
Depends on where the beef came from and the ratio of meat to fat.
So
but I'll tell you something.
I think generally speaking,
you don't want lazy people no matter what. You want people who are up off their feet and both feet firmly planted in the ground and doing contributive things in the community.
you don't want lazy people in the workforce. If you push the basic income high enough, you can filter the lazy people out of the workforce, and then the remaining workers are going to be
They're the hustlers. They're the people who are the hustlers. They're the people who get a little more and they want even more because they want to. They now say, "I'm in a new ability to do things that I didn't do before."
And that's a good thing. So I don't know that we should be saying that the lazy people who are just taking their money and not doing anything don't deserve the money, because by taking the money and staying home, they're creating more productivity in the economy. You know what I mean?
Well, they're creating more productivity in the economy in the sense that they're out doing things that make them happy. Whether that means they're out going to shows or going to theaters or doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah. They're buying things, they're spending
they're
money.
like buying a toothbrush like everybody buys toothbrush instead of just, being, grumpy at a 9 to 5, which is good for the welfare. It's good for the companies who just are regular business companies.
I think that's right. And I think, I think we have this problem in our society where oftentimes we judge people's worth based on how hard they work. And part of the reason we judge people in this way is because by judging them, it provides, incentives in the economy. It provides, like if I judge you for not working, that makes you more likely to work. That's why we've developed this kind of morality around work, because it incentivizes people to do things that need doing. But in our modern,
also there's like the devil plays with idle hands or bloody thing like that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. That's part of it.
That goes against you, because if you want less idle hands, you want to always say how do we keep people occupied? So how does a little more dough in the pocket keep people occupied? An infinite number of ways. They're going to go to the yoga studio. They're going to go to the art class. I could never afford the $20 wine and cheese and like painting classes because I have better things to spend $20 on called groceries. If you put $20 into my hand, I'd go to 5 of those a day because it would be, and I'd become a great artist because I could pursue things that bring me joy. I would take cooking classes. I would travel rather than be a miserable person, going through the crowds.
So Robert, I gotta say,
I'm droning on. And
think
I apologize
about
for that, but
I mean, we have a limited amount of time, right? So I would say think
I'll
about like if there's anything like really useful or insightful that you want to add to the conversation, because we've got we've always got a lot to talk about, a lot to explore. So it's not just about kind of embellishing on kind of like a point
Sure.
that you already made,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
Well, we should leave the last word then to this gentleman over here on the right, just because you haven't even said one since I sat down here, sir. So why don't you take the floor for a second and just, what's been in that head? I see a lot of notes on that paper.
Well, with this quote is, the quote doesn't quite say that he's trying to help poor people in San Francisco. But being a poor person in San Francisco is the worst possible idea, because you would need UBA like housing in San Francisco, which is the worst kind of housing, and you would need UBA job training, but you would need enough job training to compete with probably the most skilled place in the world.
Which would be...
So if that's what he's getting around to, that plan is the worst plan ever for poor people.
Yeah.
So
I think
UBI is a little better than UBA in your humble estimation.
Well,
Slightly.
the market suggests that the poor people take their UBI and move somewhere else, where it's so much cheaper to live that they don't even have to work. They can just live on their UBI.
Is that a good or bad
That's a
thing?
good point. I mean, we haven't talked about this.
Economically, it would be a relief.
It would smooth out the densely urbulated cities.
Yeah, and the people who feel they have to move to a big city to get a job, they can stay where they are
They
or
can
where
get
they
a
were
gig on
born.
Main Street again.
Yeah, where their family is, stay there, not go to the big city for a big job, and live where they grew up.
It's a total game changer. And the thing is, they'll have more options on Main Street because that entrepreneurial spirit, we're going to print millionaires overnight. There will be smart people who won't even know what a hustler could do with $1,000 a month. What somebody from Compton, USA, if you gave them a proper financial backing, they would invent a new type of, deli or something that we didn't even know. Like, they're now making meat out of not meat. Tell me that's not incredible. Tell me we don't want 100 more people in that game serving up tacos that are good for the environment, and they don't have to go to San Fran to make a buck.
Yeah, it definitely frees up a lot of potential, a lot of human potential if people aren't trapped in useless jobs.
Yeah.
For sure. Bethany, do you have any?
I was just going to say, I liked your point, Steve. An aspect of flexibility that we haven't talked about as much is mobility to move different places. But depending on I don't know exactly what these policies are like. Depending on the policy, that may be more restricted with the UBA. If it's like they're offering a specific house, it might be not. I don't really know.
So I just want to say that UBA, it's not like a completely fleshed out, defined thing.
Right.
And there are various policies in there that have more description than others, and different people talk about it in different ways. I tried to find an article that would be able to paint kind of UBA in a more positive light, or that would allow us to, but this is kind of like the best one I could find. And as far as, I think there is an important insight that Bethany has here, which is that if you are providing people with housing directly, how do you decide where that house is? This is not an easy question to answer. And if you want people to have mobility, do you let them choose what city they're in and then provide them a house somewhere within a radius of the location where they choose to live?
Give them a car.
I would take a hoopty any day.
Yeah. So I mean, these are questions that are really hard to answer, but they're also questions that are easily solved by the market. If you just give people the money, they can decide where to live, like what Steve said,
Or which car to.
or which car to drive.
With $1,000 a month, you'd have people who would spend it all on a car, and that'd be their prerogative, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think that's right.
And so then the dealerships who've been struggling, and I mean, they're still printing money, but and the American autos, which we bailed out, would probably be happy about it too. I mean, it's just like, we actually have to follow up on these investments that we made for our structures and our thingies so that we give people a chance. Because anytime I drove by the MSG or whatever it was, the vehicles in there, I'd put down $500 a month to drive around in one of those.
All right, then you should do that. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of the market. People get to make decisions based on their preferences more. So here's another quote. As cities and countries across the world experiment with the currently in vogue idea of universal basic income, a small but growing number of scholars, nonprofits, and researchers are beginning to argue for an alternative framework for prosperity. At its heart, they're pushing for a 21st century version of the age-old proverb that it's better to teach a man how to fish than to simply give him fish. And I selected this one because I always like to say that if you teach a man to fish, he'll be a fisherman for his lifetime. But if you give a man fish for his entire life, then he's free to do something useful with his time. And it really is this idea. Yeah, UBI is in vogue now, my mom says. It's in, yeah, I guess it is. But I mean, it's this idea, this connection that people have to be producers or they have to be self-sufficient or something. Another thing I like to say is that self-sufficiency is inefficiency. There's a reason why we trade with each other. There's a reason why we specialize, you know.
That's not a new concept either.
Yeah.
That's not 2019. That's forever.
Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I guess this is more of a detail, but I didn't really understand how the universal basic assets teach a man to fish anyway. Like, I guess they're trying to force them to learn how to invest.
Force them to manage assets.
I see, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, are you really teaching a man to fish if you're like holding his arm and
Yeah,
like, you know, like I don't.
But like managing your own assets isn't really like that useful. Well, okay, I guess I see what they're saying, but
I mean, they're thinking that they want everyone to kind of contribute and produce, and the economy is better off if everyone has the means to do that.
But a basic income, I kind of like you were saying, like it's not clear to me that a house versus a basic income allows me to contribute more.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think of houses as investments, and if you really think that someone's not going to buy a home for themselves, or you really feel like people should be owning homes instead of renting or something like that, then I can understand at least kind of like the feeling behind why forced home ownership is a positive or something like that.
People say that,
Yeah.
you know, what everybody wants to do is they want to turn 30 or 40 and own a home. But the thing is, in New York City, it's more expensive to own than it is to rent. And even in the long run, even if you make money on the house because of the upkeep, because of the taxes, because of the electrical bills and all these things that just add up. So there are people who are close to home ownership who this puts over the hump. So it kind of solves that problem.
Yeah, and it gives people more flexibility in where to live because it's an income that's not tied to a location. Like Steve said.
You're not gonna go very far with a G in San Fran,
Right?
As opposed to anywhere.
So Hortster says we need to overcome the demonization of people on welfare deemed lazy. Greater automation will naturally lead to greater unemployment regardless of people's desire to work. So I mean, I think it's true that it's not useful in our culture to demonize people on welfare. Like, it doesn't provide some kind of benefit to society. Like, I think intuitively we morally feel like if we're punishing people for being poor, then they'll kind of get off their lazy asses and kind of contribute. But we don't need them to contribute. That actually doesn't benefit us to force them to do useless work. It's just kind of like this leftover moral feeling that we have. It's not useful to demonize them. As far as greater automation naturally leading to greater unemployment goes, I don't think that's true. I think, you know, like I was saying before, we can kind of continue the status quo of making up useless jobs for people to do. There's nothing that's going to stop us from doing that, unless we decide, you know, like we have a basic income and then we start to realize, oh, maybe we don't need to be creating so many jobs. We don't need to create jobs for the sake of jobs. We can realize that we only really need jobs when there's actually work that needs doing. So I think some people assume that, okay, all these jobs are going to get automated away, then we need a solution or something like that. It's scarier than that because we have this possibility of having this kind of dystopian future that's a continuation of our status quo where people are just doing work and it's not contributing. It's not useful. So that's my thought on that. Anyone have any more comments before I move?
People can going to that to and fro that work, they can be in like rush hour traffic for like 4 hours a day or some ridiculous thing like that.
Yeah, it contributes to carbon emissions to have so many people working, and that's unnecessary carbon emissions if the work is unnecessary. Yes. Yeah. Any thoughts?
That's again the feeling, the pressure that cities are feeling when they're so condensed is because we said people are going in there because the gigs are there. But the thing is, if you just say the gigs are now where you are, because now the influx is where you are, then all of a sudden you have opportunities. Like I said, there's so many American hustlers out there that are like this close, and like now all of a sudden it's a new ball game. Like you know what a really like what's the word? Not frugal, but like really like useful person could do with their money is they could with $1,000. Not saying that's any particular number, but like you could buy a food truck, rent a food truck once a month, get the food to serve
You
you
can
people.
invest in someone else's opportunity to buy a food truck.
Like you know a chef, and that chef gets 5 people who have this to now have a piece of his business.
Yeah.
That's where you get the public-private entrepreneurs.
So let's do one more quote before we end. So giving everyone cash is not progressive, Mendonca argues in a manifesto he published on Medium in 2016. UBI doesn't get to the cause of real human needs, like job training, he says. The latter allows for independence rather than reliance. Thoughts?
Well, I guess it's just, I feel like it's a bit of a relic, the idea that reliance is necessarily bad. Well, first of all, everyone is highly reliant on their society, so it's kind of a fiction.
Yes.
That it really has to do with who has more or less prestige in our current society. So I think the fact that he like uses that word there and then it seems to be a persuasive word is actually a bit misleading because currently, right, if you have, it's highly stigmatized to be on, say, some kind of welfare program, and only the poorest people are on the program, and we demonize them, as Horster said, and so we think of quote-unquote reliance in those terms, but it wouldn't need to be thought of in those terms.
Right. We don't need to think of reliance as a bad thing. And people can have independence in terms of freedom,
right.
While at the same time they are relying on services that are provided for
Right,
them. That
like-
can help give them more
Like right
independence.
now, people are reliant on needing to have a job, and this
Right.
would make them not reliant on that, and instead
Right.
reliant on the basic income. So it's really just trading one thing for another.
And seeing
Yes.
what
Yeah.
happens to the free market economy. And most likely what's going to happen is the banks will say to the customers who are way in debt past their eyeballs, they'll say, okay, now we're going to work with you and we're going to give you a shot to go back to your business because we know that you can pay off some of your bills. It's the same thing that happened to Trump when he got in trouble with the German bank. They said, you're literally better off alive than dead. This is what that says to a million Americans who have been disenfranchised, who have been stereotyped, who have been looked down upon, who have been basically, stood their nose up at people. And this is for them to say, no longer am I cut out of this. No longer am I excluded from this great country's economic engine. Period. End
Yeah.
of story.
So it's interesting here because he says UBI doesn't get to the real cause of human needs like job training. I would say that I would reverse those two things. I would say job training doesn't get to real human needs.
It doesn't automatically. It doesn't necessarily get to it.
And also,
it
our
can
job
and it may.
Well,
but
the reason job training helps people is ultimately because it gives them money, whereas the UBI gives people money directly. And if you're training people for jobs and making them work when we don't need them to work, that's the opposite of accommodating.
And also,
you
we're
need
not
people
particularly
who
good
can
at
build
job
roads
training.
always. And the thing is,
Well-
you need those infrastructure boots on the ground, as they say, because we have more highways on this car than any other country on the planet, and it's only getting better. So you have to invest trillions in infrastructure no matter what.
So yeah, we
doesn't
should be
even
investing in
matter.
infrastructure. We should be using the minimum amount of labor, and the labor market is a market. So we'll pay people what we need to pay them to get them to work, and nothing more, and that's it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And I think he has this backwards because again, he's thinking that human needs are more tightly coupled with jobs than they are. And I mean, people do get meaning and stuff from jobs and all of that. But that's not the way it doesn't have to be that's how people live their lives. And I like to say that people need money, not jobs. Like that's human. The human needs, you can use that money to take care of your human needs. So UBI is really like one of the purest ways to get at people's human needs for the resources that are most efficiently allocated by the free market. Of course, we talked about healthcare and education and those things, and it makes sense for that to be provided more directly by the government or public-private partnerships and that kind of thing. So we're getting towards the end. I'll read one more quote, which is at the end of the article. Still, a UBA as a concept is gaining traction and emerging from the shadows of UBI to challenge it. There's more than a letter that separates them. At stake is the question of how America goes about reducing its wealth gap. So unclear to me that the wealth gap is even the issue that we should be mainly focused on. It's certainly something a lot of people care about. And UBA, he's talking about wealth gap because the assets are wealth that you hold. So that's kind of how he's framing it. So that's it. I want to go around the room and get people's final thoughts on basic income versus universal basic assets.
Yeah, so I think this was an interesting discussion about kind of which things should be provided by the government, which shouldn't, which is kind of central to this, as we talked about, but maybe not so explicitly central in the way that they would talk about it.
Yeah.
And in general, I think the baseline should be the cash, which is very flexible, as we've all mentioned. But there might be certain specific things like public infrastructure, et cetera, that you want to do differently. Yeah, and I guess one more thing I'll say about it on a rhetorical level is I suspect that one of the reasons this is popular, although I don't know, but sort of alluded to by this quote, is that people are noticing that you have to take into account not just income, but also other assets when you're trying to understand how well a person is doing in the current economy. And that makes a lot of sense. But I feel like that probably creates a sort of, by translate, I don't know quite the way to put it, but that sort of creates an appeal to thinking about giving people assets that may not actually be the right thing. They might just need more money, for example, that can turn into assets in a more flexible kind of way.
Yeah. Robert?
Second that. I think that was really well spoken, and yeah, that's the whole point. Cool.
Okay. Steve?
Well, I think this article sort of assumes the religion of work, and that if you have a job, then you're independent. If you don't have a job, then you're reliant on the state. But like I said, if you're a poor person in San Francisco needing a lot of, you're completely reliant on somebody else for your housing and your job training, so you're not independent. Apparently, if you're clever enough to just live off the land, then you're reliant on the state because you don't have a real job. So his equation doesn't make too much sense.
Yep.
Well, even if you have a job, if it's a low-paying job, you still are relying on the state because you need like food stamps or something like that. And the food stamps, you might not be able to buy what you want because you're not allowed to buy potato chips or pre-cooked food or something like that. And with job training, we're not particularly good at retraining people for jobs in this country. It's 0 to 15% success rate or something like that, according to Yang. And we might just be retraining for people for things they don't want to do in next year, or they're not particularly good at, or something like that.
Yeah, and my mom says, I don't see UBA as a good alternative to UBI. It's addressing different needs, for example, not about spending money to consumers, and is focused on the social aspects entirely. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's right. People need money in order for the economy to function, and you can't solve that by giving them assets that they may not be allowed to sell, or that kind of thing. It's a fundamental thing. People need money. And basic income is the solution to that problem. Now, certainly there are certain social programs that need to be provided by the government, and I think UBA is calling attention to that, although some of the things that they want to provide as basic assets, I think, are more efficiently allocated by the market, and that's basic income's realm. That's the domain of basic income. So I guess that actually happened. We went around faster than I thought we would. So we do have a couple more minutes if anyone has any more closing.
Let me try to paraphrase a quote from Joan.
Yeah.
Give a man a fish he eats for a day. Give a man a computer and Wi-Fi, and he can learn to fish online.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess that makes sense.
Hortster says UBA and UBI are not mutually exclusive. They would work well together. UBA provides the social safety net, and UBI provides the recipients the means to invest in their own priorities. And I think that's right. And I think it's important. If we want to call whatever the government is providing people directly, if we want to call that UBA, we can use that. We can use that term to label it. But we need to be very careful about looking at any particular thing that we want to provide people and asking ourselves, is it most efficient for the government to provide it directly, or is it most efficient to allow the markets to allocate it to people? And for the second one, UBI is going to be the answer every time. And then universal basic assets is going to be stuff like universal healthcare and education and stuff like that, and infrastructure, roads and bridges, all of that.
That's one of the first and foremost, because those are the things that pay long-term dividends for, again, the average Joe who's just trying to catch a bus to somewhere. If they spend $1 trillion on Port Authority, you know what they could make out of it? They could make the modern era Penn Station. And why shouldn't they? They have the money to do that. They just don't have the political willpower because they're struggling to keep the power on with Con Edison over there because these, trains demand so much energy as it is.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this article, back to the title of the article again, it's Universal Basic Assets, a smarter fix than universal basic income. I think a lot of the people talking about universal basic assets, and even a lot of the people talking about universal basic income, don't really understand the fundamental nature of universal basic income and what the problem is that it solves. Because they think we're trying to solve certain more specific problems with universal basic income. So they're like, no, wait, universal basic assets is a better way to do that. But it's more... Universal basic income is broader than that. It's funding the market economy, which is just something you can't ignore. And you can't expect people to get their incomes from jobs without doing a lot of damage to the labor market, creating unnecessary jobs, artificially boosting wages, stuff like that. So universal basic assets, technically I agree with it that there should be some things provided by the government. I'm not sure about the term universal basic assets. I think it's associated with kind of being an alternative to UBI, or with having more things provided by the government than is really efficient. So great discussion, guys. Next week, we're going to be back on Wednesday night, and we are talking about the second round of 2020 presidential debates. So hope to see everyone next week. Thanks for people online for participating. You guys had great comments. Good night.
Good night.